Hey everybody, Ryan Trimble here, coming to you from the Allyn Media Worldwide Headquarters Studios, high atop Two Turtle Creek, joined today, as always, by the great Shawn Williams. And I know our listeners, Shawn, have come to enjoy our witty banter, cutting up about our Fitbits, cutting up about, the recent activities going on in sports. But they have also grown used to us bringing some of the best guests, some of the most knowledgeable insiders around town, and breaking down things that are going on in Dallas. But recently, we had a really exciting opportunity for a new project.
Yeah, Ryan, I'm really excited to introduce our listeners to a 6-part podcast that we produced based on The Mad Entrepreneur, a book by Phil Romano. And this podcast is called Mad, the Phil Romano Story. And we've talked about Trinity Groves being one of our clients before, and Phil Romano is a big part of Trinity Groves. And we are also here with our colleague, Kristin Welsh, who's been working with Phil as he's promoted the book, The Mad Entrepreneur. But our podcast that we just put out on Apple Podcast, on Stitcher, called Mad, the Phil Romano Story, takes an in-depth look at Phil Romano, the success that he's had going all the way from when his grandparents immigrated to this country, all the way up through successful investments in technology that we use and that people see every day, to creating some of the most memorable restaurant concepts that this country's ever seen. So, Kristin, you've seen and worked with Phil. You've read the book. You've helped promote the book. And so, how can you explain to our listeners all the great things that you've even learned from Phil?
Oh my gosh, it's hard to sum it up. He has so many stories, and every time I'm with him, I always get a new little nugget out of him, which I always enjoy. And as a foodie myself, I've loved hearing about how he created some of the concepts that I grew up with in Plano and in the Dallas area, and ones that I still go to today, like Rudy's and Nick and Sam's and Eatsy's. So that's been really fun for me to hear. And then I love actually hearing about his early life. I mean, you'll hear some throughout the podcast, but he has some interesting stories from when he was
Interesting
younger
is a great way to put that.
and in college, and those are hilarious. And then I think another thing that shines through in the book, and when you are with him in person, is really his generosity. And he really truly wants to make a difference in people. He talks about it every day, and he doesn't just talk about it, he lives it, and you really get a sense from that when you spend time with him.
And that's, what MAD is for, making a difference. And that's a lot of what the book is about, and a lot of what Phil's life has been about.
That's right. Speaking of the book, you can go on to www.philipjromano.com, and for just $22, you too can own your copy of The Mad Entrepreneur. So we encourage our listeners to take a look at that. Consider getting your own copy of the book. It's a really fun read. Like Kristin was saying, a lot of fun, wacky stories, but some really great business advice.
And there's one wacky story, I think it's fair to say, in the podcast that we hear. And one of the jobs that Phil had revolves around the concept of crash jobs. And you can read about that in the book, but we wanted to play a quick excerpt from the podcast where Phil talks about this particular job that he had prior to getting into the restaurant business.
None of the previous gigs Phil held could have prepared him for his job with a local private eye named Jack Harwood in South Florida.
And so I ended up working part-time for a guy that was a private detective. Harvard Bureau of Investigation, okay? And I knew the guy. I'd seen him around in bars, and stuff like this. And he's a tough guy, and everything else. And he'd come up, he'd befriend me, say, you want to work while you're going to school, here you're a karate guy, good, I need somebody like you. And I said, okay. So I did that, and we, I did, investigating things, but the big thing was we would, back then in Florida, to get a divorce, you had to have evidence, there wasn't no fault stuff, you had to have evidence. So that's what we really did. We gathered evidence like that, and we would do what you call crash jobs. We'd follow people. A guy would hire us to follow his wife would follow the guy. We'd follow him and everything else, and they'd finally get into a hotel room or something, and we would call the client and say, okay, they're in there, what do you want us to do, And they said, okay, well, we'll do a crash job, and we'd knock the door down, and take pictures. Well, that was pretty good deal for me because we start $5,000 every time we did a crash job, and I get $2,500. And that's when it's going to college. We do maybe one of those a month. That was pretty good deal. As we were doing it. And there's a lot of funny stories about all that. But anyway, that was in the past.
During one infamous crash, Phil and Harwood busted into a room at Miami's popular resort motel called the Castaways. Their targets were there, just as expected. To the surprise of both, however, the man sprawled out naked on the bed was a member of the Miami Dolphins football team. In the surprise of the moment, there was a brief delay in Harwood's flashbulb going off. The assistant turned around to see what the problem was, and the bulb went off, blinding him. As Phil was struggling to find his bearings, the obviously agitated football player tackled him around the waist. The two wrestled on the floor until Phil reached for a large glass ashtray that had fallen, and cracked his target on the side of the head with it. With no regard for his young assistant, Harwood had already fled the scene with the evidence he needed. After delivering the blow, the young assistant got up and ran out the door and hightailed it to safety. Once safe, Phil realized that it might be time for a gentler profession, where dealing with people would be a bit more positive.
Shawn, we had a lot of fun recording this podcast and getting to visit with people around town. We've bragged about Kristin on Deconstructing Dallas before. Really a pleasure to work with her. She wrote one of the episodes and helped us. She's actually the star of the commercials on the episode.
Which is one of my favorite parts.
It really is.
Well, thanks, guys.
It's really nice. So, Kristin, thank you. We know that you get to hear all the wacky, wild stories firsthand and experience them firsthand, but you'll get to read about some more of them in the book.
Right. And like I said, he is just filled with great stories, and you learn something new about him every time you're with him and get to talk to him, which I'm lucky to have gotten the opportunity to do. And you learn things about him, like he was the first investor in the heart stent and the lap band that, it's like devices that, you'll hear about it in the podcast. The heart stent saved his own life, to that he's a really accomplished artist. So there's all these really great nuggets that you'll hear about in the podcast and the book that you just may not have known about him in the past.
Well, I'm really excited to share this with our listeners. We've been very fortunate to get a wonderfully loyal group of listeners who have subscribed to our podcast here at Deconstructing Dallas. And so it's been, we wanted to make sure that people realize this is a totally new concept, a totally new podcast. So you will have to go to Apple Podcasts or Stitcher or wherever you get your podcasts and search for MAD, the Phil Romano Story. Subscribe, listen to it, give a 5-star review, leave a review of what you think about this story, because we believe and have a real strong opinion, obviously, that this is something that you want to listen to. And it's been inspiring. We even find ourselves using some of the Philisms around the office to encourage each other that we get from the book and from the podcast.
Yeah, so please go on, listen to The Mad Entrepreneur. My mom loves it. Your mom's going to love it. We love it. So we encourage you to join. So take a listen, and thanks for listening to Deconstructing Dallas.